This is United States History 201, Presentation 21, The Political Crisis of the 1850s. So we're going to pick up where we left off in Unit 4 material with the end of the Mexican War and start talking about what's going to happen in the decade of the 1850s and some of the major issues that are in that particular time period, which of course is going to lead us to the war between the states. So the 1848 election is a very important election because the Democrats will nominate Lewis Cass of Michigan and the Whig Zachary Taylor of Louisiana. You also have a party called the Free Soil Party, which nominates Martin Van Buren. So this is a purely sectional party. And what's happening here is the Democrats are looking for a northern candidate to try to win votes in that section. The South was generally locked up, and the Whigs would dust off the playbook of 1840, nominate a war hero, and also a Southerner, Zachary Taylor of Louisiana, and it works. So you have each side now trying to play politics and reach into the other stronghold of that particular section to try to garner votes and then win an election. And the Whigs win in 1848 because of the fact that Zachary Taylor had such a reputation. There's no way he was going to be defeated. But he is a Southerner, so you do get some Southerners voting for Zachary Taylor for that very reason alone. You still had Southern Whigs. Lewis Cass was a war hero. He was a member of the Congress. So he did serve in the War of 1812, but didn't have the same reputation as Zachary Taylor. Now, the major issue in this time period is something called popular sovereignty. The Mexican cession, that big chunk of territory that was acquired at the end of the war, created tension in the Congress over how to organize the territory. Should it be free territory or slave territory? The political solution, advanced by Cass, who was running for president in 48, and Stephen Douglas of Illinois, is called popular sovereignty. Essentially, the people of the territory would decide if the territory would be free or slave. So, if the people of the territory want it to be free territory, then it can be. If the people of the territory want it to be slave territory, then they can be. Now, Southerners said this ignored the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for the moment, they supported it, though they were highly critical in what they often called later on squatter sovereignty. But for the time, this seemed like an expedient political solution to a problem, because they thought they could actually get people into these territories, and those territories would become pro-Southern rather than pro-Northern. So this really begins the conflict over slavery extension again, and this conflict over slavery extension will eventually become so important that it partially leads to the war. So in 1846, the reason that this all comes about is because in 1846, a man named David Wilmot of Pennsylvania attaches a rider to a military spending bill called the Wilmot Proviso. This would have prohibited slavery in any territory acquired by the Mexican War. Well, immediately, Southerners are going to stand against this thing, and it wasn't passed, but it was rejected off that bill. But people can see the writing on the wall. In fact, John C. Calhoun, who was in the Senate, issued something called the Calhoun Resolutions. And in these resolutions, Calhoun said that the territory was the common property of the United States. All states had equal access to the territory, and because the only constitutional requirement for statehood was Republican form of government, the Congress could not regulate slavery in the territories. And Calhoun said that if the balance between the North and South were destroyed, it would produce, these are his words, political revolution, civil war, and widespread disaster. So Calhoun had said these things before during the admission of Michigan as a state. He thought Michigan could come into the state as a free state. States can do what they want. But you cannot deny territories you cannot deny states from being pro-slave or free. And in essence, because the Constitution was silent on this issue, he said the government couldn't deny slavery in the territories either. This was something that if that's what the founders wanted, they would have recognized that in the Constitution. So Calhoun is fairly prophetic here. He said, look, if we keep on this path, we're going to have war. You've got to protect Southern interests in the territories. It's the only way to maintain the Union, just as you should protect Northern interests in saying, well, if the state wants to be free, it can be a free state. Calhoun had defended that position. So this all leads to something called the Compromise of 1850. President Taylor opposed any congressional action on the slavery question, but he supported the admission of California as a free state. He, of course, will die in office in July of 1850, and so the issue is left to his successor, Millard Fillmore. Fillmore supports the compromise. Taylor actually had an interesting death. He attended a July 4th celebration in Washington, D.C., but it was very hot. He's going to get heat stroke and die. And so now he's the second man to die in office. So another Whig. Here we have another Whig. William Henry Harrison dies of getting pneumonia. Taylor dies of heat stroke. So these Whigs can't hang on. There was talk of Southern secession in 1850, actually very strong talk of it here in this particular region. Eufaula, Alabama was a hotbed of Southern secession and something called the Eufaula Regency. They were definitely behind it in 1850. And because a lot of Southerners thought, well, there's no way we're going to continue to be able to win in this government. Well, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, works out a deal that in theory satisfied both sides. So this is called the Compromise of 1850. California will come into the Union as a free state. You will get the prohibition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Popular sovereignty will be the law of the land in Utah and New Mexico, the Utah and New Mexico territories, and you will get a stronger fugitive slave law. So the North would get the concession of the free state and the prohibition of the slave trade in D.C. The South would get popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico and a stronger fugitive slave law. Calhoun, who was close to death at this point, insisted the only way to preserve the Union is to give the South equal access to the territories. So he actually writes a speech not delivered by Calhoun. He dies very shortly after this. He has tuberculosis. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts would support the compromise, in part because he doesn't think slavery is viable in the desert Southwest. But the most important speech was made by William H. Seward of New York. This was called the Higher Law speech, and it was shocking to many people because this is clear evidence that people in the North were thinking beyond the Constitution. What Seward said essentially is that there's a higher law than the Constitution, and we should support that higher law. So if that's the case, well, the Constitution becomes a scrap of paper. Nobody cares about it anymore. How can you argue a position based on constitutional law and the powers of Congress when there's a higher law than that? So Seward is basically exposing the Northern position here, which is we don't really care what the Constitution says. We're just going to do what we want anyways. So after the compromise passes, Northern and Southern radicals were defeated at the polls, with only one radical, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, being sent to the Senate. Now there was Northern resistance to the Compromise of 1850. These were called personal liberty laws. So several states passed these laws, and this was a refusal of the Northern states to agree to the stronger fugitive slave law. This is essentially nullification. Southerners argued this move was unconstitutional because they're nullifying something in the Constitution, which is actually an accurate position. This was different from when the South used nullification, the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, or in the tariff controversy of 1832. The fugitive slave law was contained in the Constitution. The Congress was just simply putting that machinery into effect to enforce it. So Southerners started to look at the North as being aggressive here. The higher law speech, the personal liberty laws, the North as being aggressive and attacking the South. On the other hand, the North saw the same thing in the South, and we'll talk about this in a minute with something called the slave power. So 1852 rolls around as a presidential election year. The Whigs will nominate Winfield Scott, old fuss and feathers. They're following the plan of 40 and 48, the great war hero. The Democrats will nominate Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. They're following the plan of 48 by nominating a Northerner. There was a Free Soil Party candidate again, John P. Hale. But essentially, Pierce is going to win the election because the election is reduced to personalities of the candidates. Now, Winfield Scott was a very popular man among his men. They loved fighting for him. But his reputation as old fuss and feathers, this nasty, kind of cranky, angry guy, didn't really fit with what people wanted. And Pierce had a very nice reputation. Again, he's a Northerner, New Hampshire, and so he's going to get the election. So the important issue during the Pierce administration was territory. Southerners in his cabinet and elsewhere pushed to acquire more territory, and these are places like Cuba, territory in South America, the Gadsden Purchase. The Gadsden Purchase was a little piece of territory acquired over in now modern-day Arizona and California, and the idea was to build a Southern Transcontinental Railroad. But that was Jefferson Davis's idea, and Jefferson Davis was the Secretary of War. There were things called filibusters in South America. These were non-sanctioned military operations by the U.S. government, by people like William Walker of Tennessee, and he was picking up territory and trying to get this territory annexed to the United States. It didn't work, but there was perception that the Southerners were behind this stuff, and this is what they wanted. Cuba, there was actually a plan to buy Cuba for about $100 million, floated by a couple of pretty prominent Southerners, and that would have happened had the Spanish been willing to do it, but it doesn't go through. And so Pierce is viewed as a puppet of the Southern states by Northern interests, and Northern interests start using this term slave power. This is the slave power at work. You have slave holders who are controlling the government, and you have them pushing a slaveocracy. And of course, on the other hand, you have Southerners saying, well, these Northerners are being aggressive. So it's a slave power against Northern aggression, and these two things are going to start butting heads quite strongly in the 1850s. This is why one historian called this group the blundering generation, because they just kept blundering into this great big messy war. So there's perception and reality here. I mean, sure, there were some Southerners who were behind expansion, without a doubt. And the North was very much, the South was very much playing into the hands of the North by doing that. On the other hand, there were other Southerners who were against this kind of activity, who thought it was dangerous because of what it would do. There were also Northerners who were very aggressive, and so Southerners were pointing that out. But again, there were also Northerners who were very much interested in the Union of the Founders, and they weren't trying to block the South or eradicate slavery in the South or do anything to harm states' rights. There were a lot of Northerners who were states' rights Northerners. But you had these two very antagonistic, aggressive positions on the fringes of each side, and they're going to start really butting heads. This brings us to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Stephen Douglas of Illinois desired to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories. Now, these two territories are north of the Missouri Compromise line. So the Missouri Compromise forbade the introduction of slavery in this region. But Douglas had political and financial stake in the organization of Kansas and Nebraska. He wanted to have a transcontinental railroad cut through that land that he owned and would make a lot of money on. Plus, he wanted to be president. And he thinks that if he can organize these territories, Southerners will vote for him to be president. So he's going to try to organize the territories under popular sovereignty through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it works. It's put into effect, and so now the Missouri Compromise essentially is null and void, and popular sovereignty now is holding sway in Kansas and Nebraska. What's going to happen is catastrophic, though, for the Union. This act, Kansas-Nebraska Act, basically destroys the Union because the Whig Party will fall apart. Southern Whigs now are going to become Southern Democrats. Northern Whigs will merge into the new Republican Party. In fact, there's something called an Appeal of Independent Democrats written by several prominent Democrats in the North who say, look, the Democratic Party is dead. What they want to do is contain slavery in the South rather than have it expand. And we're going to talk about, well, there's a quote here. We want them, the territories, for the homes of free white people. They didn't want any blacks in these territories. They didn't want any, whether they're free or slave. They wanted the territories for the homes of free white people. Southerners would point to the exaggerated claims in the appeal and solidify in their opposition to Northern aggression. But again, the slave power charge had a profound rhetorical effect. It was mostly just that, rhetorical, very little substance. Though when you get to the organization of Kansas, I think you can see where both sides are trying to rush into Kansas to make it their own. So what's going to happen is a new party will form called the Republican Party. Very powerful, purely sectional though. And it's the current Republican Party. Formed in Wisconsin, their campaign slogan was free soil, free labor, free men, and it was often called white manism. So they want this territory for free white men. And they also had the American or Hamiltonian system as their economic system. They also promoted homestead legislation, which was attractive to many Westerners who wanted to go out there and live for very almost free, cheap. And so the Republican Party is made up of free soilers, know-nothings, Northern Whigs, and Democrats, Northern Democrats who are dissatisfied with the current political party structure. But the question has to be, why slavery? Why was slavery important? It is important. It's important in this period of time. People were talking about it all the time. But why was it important? Was it for moral concerns? Well, there were certainly moral abolitionists. There were people who were definitely concerned about the plight of slaves, who considered slavery to be a moral evil, who wanted to eradicate the institution from the United States. But they were a small faction, as we've already talked about. Abolitionists were considered to be on the fringe. They weren't really accepted into mainstream society. But they were there. There were moral abolitionists. But most importantly, these were political economic conflicts, and the fight was over the balance of power in the Congress. So after the Compromise of 1850, as Calhoun pointed out, the southern states were a perpetual minority in the general government. They couldn't control the Senate, they couldn't control the Electoral College, and they couldn't control the House of Representatives. And so the Union, the nature of the Union that had been around since the founding generation, was being questioned. The North controlled it, just as the South controlled it in the early part of U.S. history. We talked about that. Now the North controlled it. So who controls the spoils really is going to factor into how people are happy in this Union. Remember, Northerners wanted to secede in 1794. They wanted to secede in 1804. They wanted to secede in the 1830s. They wanted to secede all throughout American history. 1830s, it was the abolitionists. So essentially what you have here is the Southern agrarian system and direct conflict with the Northern Hamiltonian system. Whoever's going to win this battle, control the Union, is going to get their ways. So even the Free Soil Party of 48 and 52 pushed a limited Hamiltonian system. So what's ultimately going to happen is you're going to get an alliance between the West and the North, rather than the West and the South, which have been there for years. Now the West is going to align with the North, and this is going to create a perpetual majority for Northern politicians. And the South knows it, which is why they're eventually going to get out. Now, some of this had to do with legal issues. The Southern Defense of Slavery extension rested on the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment has the Due Process Clause. Now, there are two types of due process. There's substantive due process, and there's procedural due process. Southerners are arguing for a substantive due process position. Essentially, they said due process meant that the Congress could not pass any laws which would prohibit their holding of property. So, for example, if they move into the Western territories and slavery is illegal, they are not being given due process because their property is being denied to them without due process. You can't bring, and it's hard for us to understand people being property or someone owning someone's labor like this, but in the 18th and 19th century, this is the way it worked. So it'd be no different today if you had a vehicle and you wanted to go into a state and the state said you can't bring your vehicle here. You are theoretically, under this argument, being denied due process under a substantive due process position. There's procedural due process, though, which would say as long as all the proper procedures are followed, then you can be denied your property. So these are two distinct positions. But Southerners were saying that because the territory is the common property of the United States, we are allowed to bring our property into that territory. Northerners countered that because Congress could regulate the territories, they could in turn regulate slavery in the territories, and they used Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance of 1787 as justification. So the question is, the question up to debate here is the rights and equal status of the states. And not only that, how the people of the states could hold and carry their property. This is going to lead to unrest in Kansas. So Kansas, of course, is organized under popular sovereignty, and this jump-started the rhetorical maelstrom. Charles Sumner said that Missourians who settled in Kansas were hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. He's calling Southerners basically spew and vomit. And Republicans instantly claimed that civil war was erupting in Kansas. But was it? Well, essentially what you had in Kansas was pretty interesting. You had Southerners coming out of places like Alabama, even Eufaula, moving into Kansas to ensure that there were pro-Southern people in Kansas. And they were bringing some slaves with them. Republicans, though, were organizing something called the New England Immigrant Aid Society, and these people were being armed as well. These are abolitionists who are being sent into Kansas. So you've got two armed camps moving into Kansas, and perhaps it was bound that there was going to be bloodshed here. But the quote-unquote pro-slavery attacks were simply assaults on some property damage, which of course is egregious, but no one was really harmed in these things. But the free soil attacks were led by a man named John Brown, and he was going to essentially commit homicide on some pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas. He's going to do this in the middle of the night with his sons, and they hack these people to pieces. This is not a battle. This is a homicide. Lawrence was just some property destruction by pro-Southern forces, which resulted in rhetorical charges that here the pro-slavery men are in power, and they're going to disrupt things in Kansas. Now, Sumner is going to give a very important speech in the Senate called the Crimes Against Kansas speech. This offended Southerners and also ridiculed Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Now, Butler had a speech impediment that caused him to lisp. And so during the speech, Charles Sumner will start lisping. And Butler wasn't around, but his nephew, Preston Brooks, was. And he burst into the Senate chamber while Sumner was working at his desk and caned him, beat him senseless. Sumner in Massachusetts would leave his seat vacant in protest while Brooks is reelected by crushing majorities and sent canes from across the South. So the Northern press is going to use it as an example of Southern brutality. Here's this guy beating up Charles Sumner. It's a pen against the sword, essentially. But, Sumner was being a coward here and picking on a guy that's not even there to defend himself. This brings us to the 1856 election. The Republicans, by the way, let me back up a couple of slides here and talk about Kansas. One more thing. There was something called the Lecompton Constitution. It was a pro-slavery constitution that was agreed to in Kansas, and this thing was highly controversial. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But the 1856 election rolls around. The Republicans will nominate John Charles Fremont of California, so they actually have enough clout now to organize and nominate a presidential candidate. He's going to get quite a lot of votes. Their campaign slogan was free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont, and victory. The Democrats again will nominate a Northerner, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. You also have something called the American Party. These are know-nothing men. They nominate Millard Fillmore, the former president of New York. Buchanan will win a very close election on the support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty. Which brings us to one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history, the Dred Scott case. This is the first time since 1803 that the court has struck down a law of Congress, declared it unconstitutional. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time was a man named Roger B. Taney. Now, Taney, in fact, was an abolitionist. He did not support slavery, but he and Buchanan had cut a deal. Essentially, Taney and Buchanan had decided that if Taney can rule on a particular issue like this, maybe they can put the slavery issue to rest forever. So what happens is Dred Scott, a Missouri slave, sues for his freedom in federal court. The Supreme Court, this case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will rule in a couple of different ways. First, they will say that Scott was not a citizen and therefore cannot sue in federal court. So the Supreme Court did not have jurisdiction in the case. They'd stop there, okay, fine. But they didn't. So then Taney would issue more to the ruling. He would say that the Missouri Compromise of 1850, and Kansas-Nebraska Act were all unconstitutional because they violated the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. So he's going to take the substantive due process position and say that all these things violate the Fifth Amendment. And Northerners, this is, again, clear example. Here's a slave power at work. Southerners said the issue was dead and all efforts to regulate slavery in the territory should be ignored. In fact, they were getting very hostile at this. So again, you have two sides just banging against each other here. And here, of course, is the Lecompton Constitution. Kansas would adopt a pro-slavery constitution that applies for statehood in 1857. Northern settlers, though, refused to participate, perhaps to keep the slavery issue alive and help Republicans, but more than likely because they had sharp differences over other issues of political economy. So the Lecompton Constitution was rejected by a crushing majority in an 1858 referendum with pro-slavery men abstaining. But Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution. He wanted Kansas to come in as a pro-slavery state, so Buchanan supported this thing, which was actually adopted by an elected convention. The pro-freedom people, the anti-slavery people, had refused to go to the convention. So Kansas is going to remain in limbo here and cause all kinds of problems. Now, 1858 is also a year in which you have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln will make a name for himself. He'll become prominent during this period. And Stephen Douglas, of course, is running for his re-election in his Senate seat in 1858. These are often cited and quoted. In fact, they're going to bring Lincoln to prominence and effectively end Douglas's chance of securing the Democratic nomination for president in 1860. Lincoln's views on race and slavery are definitely exposed here. He was not a person who believed in the equality of the races. He said slavery was fine essentially as long as it's locked up in the southern states. I don't need it in Kentucky or Illinois or wherever else you're talking about. Douglas is going to issue something called the Freeport Doctrine. He says, look, I know that the Supreme Court through Dred Scott has said that popular sovereignty is unconstitutional, but I'm still going to believe it in anyways. So Lincoln's going to make a very famous speech here, the House Divided speech. The question was, how accurate was it? Could a house part free and part slave exist? Lots of places have done this. There's no saying that the two sections could not have gotten along for certain reasons, but they might have had to part ways at one point. 1859, though, is an important year because an anti-slavery fanatic, John Brown, who massacred people at Pottawatomie Creek, will raid into Harper's Ferry. He has a group of men called the Secret Six who are funding him. These guys are very wealthy members of New England anti-slavery societies, and they had written instructions, though, that if anything ever came out about this, they were going to deny everything. Brown would plan to invade the South by force and create a slave republic. His army of 18 men invade Virginia at Harper's Ferry, but are soundly defeated. Brown is actually wounded and then captured. The first person killed, though, was a black man, and no slaves come to John Brown's raid. So Brown at first was denounced by Republicans, but he becomes a martyr. this solidified Southern fears that the North intended to exterminate them. So Southerners started looking at John Brown as like Jesus Christ. So if Brown was Jesus Christ, as some suggested, then what would happen to Southerners should the government fall into the hands of the people who supported him? So you start having a lot of fear, suspicion, mutual distrust between the sections, which will grip the United States. And William H. Seward again would make another important speech, the irrepressible conflict speech, which would rank right up there with his higher law speech.